All right. So today's Lunch and Learn from Gardner's Wharf to Elizabeth Street, searching for Rhode Island slavery in the CHS archives. We will be presented by Dr. Edward E. Andrews. He is an associate professor in the Department of History and Classics at Providence College, and he is the author of Native Apostles, Black and Indian Missionaries in the British Atlantic World. And his new project, under contract with Cornell University Press, will be the first book-length treatment of Newport Gardner, an important yet overlooked figure in early American history. And so we're going to hear about this new project today. Dr. Andrews is currently a fellow for the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, as well as a Summer Scholars Fellow through Providence College. And Dr. Andrews was here at the CHS over the summer, and so we're really excited to hear about his findings and get an update on this research. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. Go ahead, Dr.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's been, I might be, after like doing Zoom University for like a year and a half, I might be a little bit rusty on the Zoom. So I apologize for that. I also apologize if my voice is a little bit raspy. Probably like a lot of you, I've been nursing a chest cold over the last couple of days. So I'm going to sound like a rock star, like or something like that, like somebody who's been doing something like that in his whole life. Let me see. I'm just pulling up my PowerPoint. Let me see if I can do this. Okay. Jen, can I get a thumbs up if you can see that? Okay, good. Again, sorry about my throat here. So yeah, I'm really excited today to talk about the project that I'm working on right now, which is about a man named Akramar Mariku, also went by the name of Newport Gardner. And before I start, Jen had mentioned this, but I really want to thank the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium for allowing me the funds and the time to be able to go to fantastic archives all throughout New England, including the Connecticut Historical Society. And also want to thank Providence College for a Summer Scholars Fellowship, which allowed me to do the same. For today's talk, what I plan on doing, I was just talking with Jen about this earlier, is that I'm going to kind of assume, no knowledge, or maybe not that much knowledge about Newport's history. So I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of a background of Newport, Rhode Island in the 18th century in the context that Newport Gardner was living in, and then talk specifically about Gardner's life. And then the last part of it, I'm going to speak about some of the things that I found in the Connecticut Historical Society archives over the course of the summer. What's sort of interesting is that I still have, I don't know, I think maybe five to 8 more days for my New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. So I still have a few more days actually at the Connecticut Historical Society. So it's, in some ways, I'm kind of workshopping some of this. A lot of this is still in draft form, and I'm excited to answer your questions as we get towards the end. So I think, Jen, you're looking for questions in the chat. Is that sort of the approach? Okay, good. All right, awesome. So again, welcome, and thank you everybody for coming. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm doing a project that deals with the issue of slavery in New England. And when I started in graduate school, which was like 2001, there were a few books about this, but I really didn't know that much about it really at all. And over the last 10 to 20 years, there has been just a flourishing of scholarship on the question of slavery in New England. I just have a couple examples here. Wendy Warren's book, New England Bound, which talks about slavery and colonization in early America. And then also Dark Work by Christy Clark Pujara, which deals with sort of the economic side of slavery in Rhode Island, but also is a nice, I found it to be sort of a nice overview of slavery in Rhode Island in general. One of the things that I've noticed in a lot of these works is that there's not as much sort of biographical treatment. And one of the reasons for that is because of problems related to sources. And so this is going to be one of the big themes that I talk about today, is how do we sort of reconstruct lives and sort of reimagine the worlds that these people lived in light of the fact that we have really limited source material. So that's one of the themes I want to sort of explore today. When we think of Newport, actually, maybe this can be a chat question from like group participation, since I'm very much, it's like the middle, kind of it's 2/3 through the semester. So I'm still in like teaching mode. So maybe we can throw in the chat, when you think of Newport, Rhode Island, What do you think of? So maybe you can put that in the chat, and maybe Jen can report the findings. But when you think of Newport, if you've been there, or if you've visited, or just curious what you think of. So I'll let those answers roll in, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
We have wealth, vacations, trafficking of enslaved people from Tracy, chowder.
Chowder, yeah.
Anybody else? Great architecture, the early synagogue. We were just talking about that. Yeah, lots of things.
I'll do a quick plug. Somebody had mentioned the great architecture. There's a relatively new book that came out called Newport, the Artful City by John Church. I have a little kind of essay in here, so it's sort of a little bit of self-promotion, but it's a really great like coffee table book that sort of talks about the structure and the architecture of Newport. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we can arrange it. But yeah, I'm actually in some ways sort of surprised. Some people had said, well, usually folks will say the mansions, right? So they'll say the mansions, and usually you'll hear sort of the yacht clubs and sailing and things like that. Those are the things that Newport is most known for. Somebody had mentioned, the African slave trade, and that is becoming, I think the fact that is one of the answers now suggests that there really has been a sort of dawning, a greater awareness of Rhode Island's role in the transatlantic slave trade, and Newport in particular. And I think for the most people in the general public, they do think of things like, wealth and luxury and sort of this 19th century robber baron world of the mansions. But Newport has a very kind of long and tumultuous history that dates back even well before the 1630s, when the first English settlers got there. And I'm not going to spend much time, or really any time, on the kind of past indigenous history of it. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the 18th century. But there is a really rich history there that we should kind of think about and recognize. I'd say, the two big things to know about, Newport's history for the purpose of this talk are kind of the religious, background, as well as sort of the economic context. So one of the things that's interesting about Newport is the fact that it was a space built upon the principle of religious toleration. It doesn't necessarily mean that things were completely equal, or everybody was accepted equally, but in Newport, Rhode Island, there was sort of an interesting range of different religious congregations. There were actually a large number of Quakers and Jews who came to Newport towards the end of the 17th century, and it also became a sort of meeting spot for a wide range of people, Baptists, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, all sorts of different groups. So Newport is going to be a really interesting city because it's going to be pretty religiously diverse. There's going to be a lot of religious pluralism there. But in addition to that, it's also, just going back to this, it's also a harbor. And I was actually talking to a colleague of mine who's a historian, but also a sailor. And I didn't realize this, that Newport it's not just a harbor, it's a really good harbor, like really well protected harbor. And if you can see this, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Jen, are you able to see my cursor when I kind of go around there? But this space was called the Long Wharf. And basically, when you enter into Newport Harbor, you're entering in sort of from the south side over here. You're entering into Narragansett Bay, so that leads up into like Warwick Neck and up into Providence. But over here, Newport as a city is really well protected. And this space here where the Long Wharf is, the water here is actually really deep. It's 20 to 40 feet deep. So it has the ability sort of almost naturally to hold pretty large vessels. And in an era before the Cape Cod Canal, Newport, Rhode Island emerged not only as a place that was kind of remarkable for this religious pluralism, but also as basically the economic center of southern New England. There are relatively large or growing colonial cities in the 18th century, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charlestown, but Newport was tied with Charlestown in terms of total population. And as somebody mentioned in the chat as well, Newport became increasingly involved in transatlantic economic activity, and in particular, the slave trade. And this is sort of where our story connects. Newporters, over the course of the 1750s and really into the 1760s and beyond, became some of the most active slave traders in early America. And in fact, there are a couple images I don't have time to show you, but there are some really kind of interesting paintings that reveal this as well. And one of the people who is very involved in the slave trade early on during this period was a person named Caleb Gardner. And Gardner was born in the late 1730s. He doesn't appear to come from a lot of wealth. He comes from sort of a mercantile family rather than like a landed sort of aristocratic family. But over the course of the 1750s and then into the early 1760s, he emerges as a captain and then an owner of a large number of slave ships. And even, we'll talk about this later, but after the American Revolution, he actually becomes one of Rhode Island's most active slave traders. Some of you might have heard of like the Vernons, or more kind of controversially, the DeWolf family from Bristol. Caleb Gardner was sort of in that orbit after the American Revolution. So this is sort of where we get the story, the emergence of the story of Newport Gardner, because Newport Gardner is going to be enslaved to this person named Caleb Gardner. So let's talk a little bit about Newport Gardner, aka Akrama in general, the larger context here. So he was an African who became enslaved to one of Newport's biggest slave traders, Caleb Gardner, who I had mentioned. It's interesting, you know, Caleb Gardner, his career began really in the 1750s when he was kind of in his early 20s, but he became a much more active slave trader, you know, before the revolution, then immediately afterwards. So there's an interesting kind of paradox here, because as we'll talk about, Newport Gardner is going to emerge as a major community leader in the Black community in Newport, Rhode Island. But he's enslaved to one of the largest slave traders. So it's a way to sort of think about the story about this paradox of slavery and freedom in early America in a really kind of focused way. So he was first born Akrama. We don't know, to be honest with you, that much about his origins. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the possibilities to think about his origins that are revealed to us through the records of the Connecticut Historical Society. But we don't really know that much. It's like there's like local folklore that I'll talk about, but that's not always necessarily reliable. We do know that it's most likely that he came from either Cape Coast, probably the Gold Coast, specifically Cape Coast Castle or Anamabo. Those were like the two most important kind of slave trading ports for Newport slave traders to go to. And in fact, the Gardner family, Caleb Gardner had an older brother, John, who was also a slave trader who sort of started before him. They went exclusively to Cape Coast Castle and Anamabo. So we can kind of narrow down most likely where Akrama was coming from. But we know that he gets to Newport sometime around 1760, maybe in the early 1760s, more generally. And again, he's enslaved to this kind of aspiring slave trader. We don't know much about the work that he did. Unfortunately, Caleb Gardner didn't leave a lot of records behind or mentions of what Newport Gardner was up to. We do have a lot of information about what was happening to Caleb Gardner during the American Revolution, and I talk about that in the book, but most of the sort of things that we have about Newport Gardner are contextual for the 1760s and the 1770s. That changes by the time we get to the 1780s and early 1790s. There's actually a lot of primary source material about Newport Gardner when we get to the post-revolutionary period, including the fact that he won a lucky lottery ticket in 1791. He went in with a bunch of other Black individuals and won, apparently split the pot. It was like a $2,000 prize in a Massachusetts semi-annual state lottery. And he was able to use that to buy his freedom. But as I'll talk about in the sort of the second portion, or the last portion of the talk, his emancipation also was connected to the larger context of abolitionism and the debate over transatlantic slavery in the 1790s. really interestingly, he becomes like immediately after his emancipation, he becomes a major community leader in Black benevolent societies. And this is something that is really fascinating to me because Newport has a bunch of different sort of free African benevolent societies that emerge in the 1780s and the 1790s. And, Newport Gardner is involved in every single one of them. When I first started this research project, I wanted to kind of just write a story of race and slavery in Newport, Rhode Island. And as I started to write that story, his name kept popping up. I'd see Newport Gardner over and over and over and over again. And it's because he served as a kind of leader in the free Black community. He served as a secretary for these benevolent societies. It's actually really fascinating. The Newport Historical Society and the Rhode Island Historical Society, between the microfilm and the manuscript copies of these items, I mean, there are hundreds of pages of records of these Black benevolent societies that Newport Gardner was involved with. And so it does really give us a sense of what the Black community was focused on, what it was interested in the post-revolutionary years, as well as Newport Gardner's kind of central place in these discussions. He was also a major Christian leader. He emerged in Newport's first congregational church he was a sexton and a deacon as well. And eventually in 1824, he actually founds the first independent Black church in Newport with a bunch of other free Black individuals in the town. The church was founded at his house, which is really interesting. And also the articles of faith that were for the church, the basic sort of theological principles, were drafted by Newport Gardner himself. And so he's a community leader. He's a kind of in the Black benevolent societies. He's a secretary. He's a parliamentarian. I also want to think about him a little bit as a sort of like a theologian in some ways, thinking about some of these issues, the relationship between the human and the divine. So he becomes a major Christian leader in Newport's congregations. He's also a music teacher, and there's local lore to suggest that he's a published composer. I need to do a little bit more thinking about that, but there is some evidence to suggest that he was, some of his original work was published in a sort of music compendium that was published in 1803. But one of the things that the Black benevolent societies do is they start these kind of independent Black schools. And Newport Gardner becomes one of the most important characters in these Black schools, and even opens up a music school as well. And so there's a big kind of musical component to Newport Gardner's experience that I'm also exploring as well. He was also somebody who engaged in a lot of other jobs and occupations in the post-revolutionary years to try to make do for his family, to try to scrape by, in the words of Seth Ruckman in his book about Baltimore. Newport Gardner had a lot of children. He had 13 kids over the course of the 1770s, 80s, and into the 1790s. And so he had a family to provide for, living in this kind of post-revolutionary context. So the archival records show him as a school teacher, show him as a shoe shiner, as a gardener. The Rhode Island Historical Society has really rich records of the first congregational church and how they were buying candles from Newport Gardner to light their church during the kind of winter months during their meetings. So he's somebody who did a variety of different types of jobs to try to get by. And eventually, this sort of towards the end of his life, because he did lead this really fascinating and long life, he brought a group of free Black Rhode Islanders to Liberia in 1826. This is a project that actually had its origins back in the 1780s. I had mentioned these Black benevolent societies that emerged in the post-revolutionary years. One of the big things that they're talking about is the possibility of African emigration. And they're talking with various leaders throughout the Atlantic world about the possibility of moving to Sierra Leone at the time. This is the 1780s and the 1790s. Over the next few decades, there's not as much conversation about that. But then with the rise of the American Colonization Society around 1816, the birth of Liberia as a colonization site, this sort of reemerges again. And Newport Gardner becomes the core person in this discussion for free Black Rhode Islanders. And so there's probably about around 35 free Black Rhode Islanders who go with Newport Gardner to Liberia in 1826. It's actually really interesting because before they leave, they head up to Boston first, and they're gonna leave Boston. They're supposed to leave at the end of December of 1825, but because of weather, they don't leave until early 1826. But when they go up to Boston, they get welcomed by Park Street Church. And this is in the sort of mid 1820s. And some of you may know a little bit about Park Street Church, but Park Street Church is actually a really interesting place because it's sort of the center and focal point in Boston for a lot of like 1820s reform efforts. And so I talk a little bit about how this was kind of part of this like Christian reformer mentality that was emerging in this particular space, which is really kind of interesting and leads to a lot of different connections. So Newport Gardner and his retinue, they leave in early 1826 and end up in Liberia just a couple months afterwards. But tragically, Gardner dies within the first couple of weeks that he's there. And actually, a lot of other people in that group die as well. And what is kind of interesting about that is that these stories of the death of these free Black Rhode Islanders, they make their way, those stories make their way back into the press over the course of the summer of 1826. And it becomes a sort of lightning rod or like a flashpoint for people thinking about the negative implications and the dangers of African colonization, because African colonization in the 1820s is a highly controversial subject. And so a lot of people in New England sort of pick up on this story of Newport Gardner and the failure of that particular group to thrive in the first couple weeks, and just the sheer number of people who had died. They use that sort of in these kind of polemical discussions and editorials in the newspapers. So Newport Gardner's kind of life and his death become entwined in this discussion over colonization, which is really interesting. So I think the main point that I'm trying to kind of offer here is that, you know, Newport Gardner is a figure who he's sort of known in Newport itself. There's a lot of local lore about him. If you go on a walking tour of Newport, you might hear his name or hear a little bit about him. There's a lot of this sort of 19th century reminiscence history. I'm guessing Connecticut probably has some of that type of literature too, but Rhode Island had a ton of it, like the kind of 19th century nostalgia type of history that was really popular at that time. And Newport Gardner appears in some of those stories. He's got a Wikipedia page, so he's not a completely obscure person. It's not like nobody's ever heard of him or anything like that. But what I started to realize in my research is that he's extraordinarily prominent in Southern Rhode Island, and kind of everywhere you go, everywhere you look, whether you're looking at Black benevolent societies or the development of Black Christianity or the colonization debate, Newport Gardner was in the middle of those discussions, which is really interesting. So a key point that I'm trying to make here is that Gardner should be sort of thought of as one of these early kind of Black leaders in the post-revolutionary years, put alongside people like a Prince Hall or a Richard Allen or some of these other more kind of prominent characters. And he may be, more of like a kind of second-tier leader in terms of his national recognition. But still, in New England, he was a very well-known figure and very fascinating person to explore. And I also think sort of the second part is that, looking at his life and his experiences give us a better sense of the ways in which, both slavery and freedom functioned in early America more broadly. So as a kind of leader in Black benevolent societies, as a Christian figure, a music teacher, an African colonization, he lived a very fascinating and interesting life, and something I want to, obviously, I'm spending more time exploring. I want to talk, so I'm just checking my time. Okay, good. We're doing good on time. All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that I had found, and I wanted to do 3 things, but I'm still sort of figuring out what the third one is. There are some sources of the Connecticut Historical Society that can lend some light into the economic landscape in Newport, but I'm still sort of working through them and trying to figure out how to make sense of them. So I'm going to pause on that. But instead, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on kind of almost like the bookends of Newport Gardner's enslavement. So there are two sources that can lend some insights both into Newport Gardner's origins and into his emancipation that happened in the 1790s. And the first is a manuscript account of an earlier missionary plan, which can shed some light on Newport Gardner's origins. So one of the texts that the Connecticut Historical Society has is a manuscript copy of a circular letter that was sent out from Newport by a couple of white Newport ministers to a bunch of other minister figures throughout New England in the early 1770s. And it was basically a missionary plan. I wrote about this in my book, but the angle that I'm taking on this is a little bit different. It was a missionary plan to have two free Africans, two recently freed Africans, become missionaries in Africa. And so there are two white ministers, Ezra Stiles, who, if you're in Connecticut, you probably have heard of because he becomes president of Yale after the American Revolution, and Samuel Hopkins. And interestingly, even though Stiles has this connection to Yale, Samuel Hopkins was really close with Levi Hart, who is a minister in Connecticut as well. So he had a lot of sort of epistolary connections and friendship connections with a lot of these associates. So Samuel Hopkins and Ezra Stiles, one of the main things they do to get support for this missionary plan to send two newly freed Africans, quote unquote, back to Africa, is they do what a lot of missionaries would do, which they would publish sort of an account of how things are going so far and a solicitation for funds, right? And they do this in the 1770s. In 1776, there's a published version of this. There was an earlier version in 1773, but you can see sort of the printed version here, which is really interesting. And the two major figures who were going to be involved in this were characters named Bristol Yama and John Quamine. What the Connecticut Historical Society has, which is really interesting to me, is they have a manuscript copy of this circular letter, which is really similar, like almost word for word identical to what eventually was printed, but it's slightly different in some of the details. And I'm really focused on the details. And one of the things that I found in the manuscript copy, which is fascinating, is they wanted to talk about the origins of the two enslaved Africans who had now got their freedom and were going to be missionaries to West Africa. So one of them claimed that he was basically from a wealthy coastal African family, and that he had been sort of tricked into slavery and sent to Rhode Island, kind of by mistake. And so Samuel Hopkins and Ezra Stiles wanted to see if this was actually valid, if this was true. And it turns out it was. They wrote to various figures in West Africa because they had these strong epistolary connections, especially to Cape Coast Castle and Anamabo. And they wrote to people in West Africa to inquire about this backstory that John Quamine had, that he was sort of the son or the nephew of these large and important kind of coastal African trading families. And one of the people that they wrote to was a character named Philip Kwak, who he himself was an African. He was a missionary for a group of Anglicans. And they asked Philip Kwak, hey, we have somebody here in Newport, Rhode Island, who claims he's from this wealthy coastal African family. Can you validate this? And Kwak does a little bit of research and writes back and says, yes, this is actually true. And Kwak then goes on to name names, right? He names his mother, he names John Quamine's father, his uncle who's in charge. It's really, really specific. The reason why I mention this is because this is the exact same story, the exact same origin story for Akramar Mariku. It's the exact same origin story for Newport Gardner. There's this sort of folklore that develops in the 19th century that Newport Gardner was somebody who was the son or nephew of a coastal African trader, and basically was, enslaved by mistake. Again, it's a very parallel story to John Quamine. And scholars who have looked at this story have said, this is most likely apocryphal. And I'll be honest and say, it probably is in some senses, because this was a very common trope and a very common theme in like 18th century literature about Black Atlantic figures. This was the trope of what scholars call the African prince. And so this is a trope that sort of gets applied to Newport Gardner. A lot of people have said it's not true, it's probably fake, and things like that. But what's interesting is that in doing research at the Connecticut Historical Society, it's sort of made me rethink the potential possibility of this, because at first it does appear like just a literary trope. But if you merge the evidence from John Kwame's experience, where there are kind of archival primary sources to validate that he was from a powerful and wealthy coastal African family, mixed in with sort of West African trading family practices, you realize that this actually was a relatively common phenomenon, not an entirely uncommon phenomenon. And one of the main historians to sort of figure this out is somebody named Randy Sparks, who has written a couple of stories about and done historical research into a couple of these figures who, similar to John Kwame, similar to the sort of lore about Newport Gardner, were people who were from wealthy African trading families and were used as, the word he uses and the word that's often used in the 18th century was pawns. So one of the ways that West African coastal trading families would make alliances with and kind of cement bonds with white slave traders from Rhode Island or from England or wherever, one of the things that they would do is they would basically send members of their family to be with, to serve with, to live with these white families. And Sparks is really good talking about sort of the intercultural exchange that's happening in West Africa as part of this process. And so even though it is a kind of very common like literary trope, and it seems sort of like an unusual type of story and, probably apocryphal, the more that I'm looking into these practices and that were happening in Cape Coast Castle and Anamabo, and the fact that somebody like John Kwame had this exact story validated through the primary sources, there is a possibility that this was the case for Newport Gardner as well. So I think what's interesting about this is that it's bringing up a lot more questions than answers, but it's making me be a little bit more open to the other interpretive possibilities. It is possible that Newport Gardner was from a wealthy coastal family, was given to a Rhode Island slave trading captain as part of a deal to sort of cement bonds, and if the deal went south or went awry, was taken and enslaved. This was a pretty common thing that happened in the 18th century. So even though it is a literary trope, it actually was a common practice when it came to West African slave trading, which is sort of interesting. So I'm still trying to figure that out. But for me, it's just fascinating that John Kwame's story and Newport Gardner's story are really kind of parallel, and it's quite fascinating and interesting. Let's see, let me just get. The second thing that I found, and I wanted to mention this because I had looked for this for a really long time, and we had a problem trying to find it. So this is a document, a very specific letter that's found in the Oliver Wolcott Jr. papers. And it's really interesting because the Oliver Wolcott papers are just like massive, right? They're absolutely huge. There's volumes and volumes of these papers. And so trying to find one specific letter is pretty difficult to do. And so I'm really thankful to the Connecticut Historical Society staff for finding this. So I was looking for a particular letter that was written from Oliver Wolcott to David Barnes, who was in Rhode Island. So Wolcott at the time, this was in 1799, Wolcott at the time was a Treasury secretary, and David Barnes was basically like the kind of district attorney for Rhode Island. And what they're talking about, or what Wolcott is talking about in the letter, is sort of the difficulty in prosecuting cases involving the transatlantic slave trade. There had been a bunch of sort of state laws and other initiatives. The national end to the transatlantic slave trade from a legal perspective is not going to happen for another like 9 years. But there had been kind of previous legal attempts to do this. And one of the interesting things that Walcott says here is that, even though you have these laws on the books, nobody's really following them, right? And so it's sort of this debate about, okay, you have these laws, but they're not really put in practice. Barnes and Walcott talked about the possibility, is there a possibility that sort of people who are involved in the slave trade would work to repeal the laws and try to make it kind of openly legal again? And Walcott in this particular section says, I doubt that anyone would have the boldness to propose such a measure, right? Like he's saying, even though they're evading the slave trade very, very blatantly, I don't think anybody would have the boldness to actually repeal slave trade laws. And then he says, and this is the image that you have in front of you. He says, in my opinion, a motion for repealing the law against the slave trade would be as indignantly received as a proposal for legalizing piracy, arson, or murder, right? So he's talking about the fact that, publicly there is a sort of outcry against the transatlantic slave trade, but also publicly you have these slave traders who are still kind of blatantly doing it, right? The reason why this matters is because this fits into the conversation about Caleb Gardner, his kind of identity as a slave trader, and Newport Gardner's eventual emancipation. So one of the points that I make in the book is that Newport Gardner, he gets his freedom in 1791 due to a lucky lottery ticket. And between the letters where people are, ministers and others are talking about this event, the printed materials about it, even kind of later local folklore about it, there are a lot of different explanations as to why this happened. So some people say this was the divine hand of Providence. Some people are saying this is sort of just a stroke of luck that he got his freedom. There's kind of a debate about whether this was, divine benevolence or just sort of luck or, whatever. So what's really interesting about it, though, is that in 1791, it's happening at precisely the same time that there's a very public court case against Caleb Gardner as a slave trader. And this was a case that was tried in Massachusetts, and it actually had started back in like 1789, but took sort of years to go through the court system. And it wasn't until the spring of 1791, within the exact same time that Newport Gardner gets his freedom, that the case is eventually resolved. And the reason why I bring this up is because in this letter, Oliver Walcott talks about the possibility, and this is 8 years later, this is 8 years after the Caleb Gardner cases, Oliver Walcott talks about the possibility of suing prominent slave traders to make an example out of them. And so he says, if we sue them, right, for slave trading, the suit ought to be commenced against some individual of such property and influence as would test the efficacy of the laws and shield the government from all suspicions of having been influenced by any other motive than a determination to execute the law. The reason why I bring that quote up and why it's fascinating is because exactly what Oliver Walcott says in this quote has already happened, right? That has already happened to Caleb Gardner, who was at that time one of the most prominent slave traders. And in fact, the Massachusetts and Providence figures like the Providence Society for Abolishing the Slave Trade, they went after Caleb Gardner precisely because he was Caleb Gardner. So what Oliver Walcott is suggesting here, which is really interesting, it's 8 years after the slave trade case, it's suggesting that the case that Caleb Gardner was involved in didn't have the desired effects, that people kept slave trading. Even if they were doing it illegally and evading the law, they kept sort of ignoring it. So it had very little effect. These types of court cases, even the ones that Walcott is suggesting they should pursue, those types of court cases didn't have the desired effect. That's kind of one side of the story. But the counterpoint to that is that even though it didn't stop Caleb Gardner from slave trading in the 1790s and even into almost to the time of his death up into 1806, one of the arguments that I do make is that because it coincided exactly with the time of Newport Gardner's emancipation, I'm actually convinced that it provided a sort of larger context for him to free Newport Gardner. And so it didn't result in a major change in his slave trading activities. But I'm suggesting that in combination with the lottery ticket actually allowed a space for Newport Gardner to get his freedom, because there was probably a lot of public pressure that was put on Caleb Gardner. So I mentioned the Oliver Wolcott papers precisely because the court case that was happening in Massachusetts in 1791 is exactly what Oliver Wolcott wanted to have happen in order to prosecute slave traders. And even 8 years after the Caleb Gardner slave case, people are still talking about this as a possibility, but as we can see, it wasn't 100% effective. And I just wanted to bring that up because it's a fascinating example, and it was a difficult source to find. So I want to thank the Connecticut Historical Society staff again. I should say before I'm going to turn it over to looking at the time, I have a couple minutes left. I want to turn it over for questions, but I should say that there's still a lot for me to look at the Connecticut Historical Society. I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm about halfway through my tenure, so I spent a few days there, and it's still kind of a work in progress. But there are a couple of things that can reveal the possibilities of free Black economic activities in Newport. There's the diaries of Sarah Osborne, who was a major religious leader in the 1760s and 1770s and 80s, a major 18th century religious leader who Catherine Breckus has written some great material on. So I want to sort of get in there and look a little bit at sort of the religious context in more detail. And then there's also papers and letters between Samuel Hopkins and Levy Hart as well, which could be really illuminating, because they often talked about issues like manumission proposals, religious issues relating to like authority over deacons and ministers and things like that could have a real impact on the way we think about this context in the 18th century. So I think I'll stop there because I'm at my 12:45, but just wanted to share a little bit about my research on Newport Gardner and also offer a couple of things that I found that I'm still sort of working through, and I'd be interested to hear your questions. So I guess I'll stop my share, and I think Jen might have some questions from the chat, perhaps.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And we can, if you'd prefer, you could raise your hand or unmute yourself. That will work as well.
I'm just going back through the chat, and I saw folk. Yeah, I didn't mention that. Yeah, the Jazz Fest, folk music. Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah.
Bonnie's asking, did you find any connections to Jamestown, Rhode Island?
I haven't found anything that's really concrete. One thing that is kind of enticing is that in the post-revolutionary, or in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period, one of Caleb Gardner's jobs is to basically like confiscate land owned by loyalists. And there is some evidence that he takes that. It's happening in Newport, but it's also happening in Jamestown as well. He's also kind of responsible for shoring up maritime defenses around Jamestown as well, but there's nothing kind of specific in terms of, enslavement practices or anything like that. Probably the best kind of material for that would be thinking about the Revolutionary period. So there are a couple connections, but they're not super strong,
Another question, Tracy is wondering, did Newport have Black governors? Those in Hartford often claim to be African princes.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, and I wrote an article about this a while back, and they had these similar things, the Black elections, and the way that I had talked about it, I was interested in the practice, but also what's really interesting in Newport is kind of the space that they used. So you had mentioned the use of African princes, and I don't know if I see that. I have to go back and see if I find that in the archival material. But one of the things that was really interesting was sort of the space that they used. So there was a site kind of on the outskirts of town where they would have these sort of annual like Black election days, and they would happen in late June. And there was the local folklore says this, right, that they would elect a Black governor. But what was really interesting about it is that they would do this at this sort of large tree kind of in this triangular plot of land that was kind of near the cemetery. And what's fascinating is that the historical record, local histories say that, African individuals were having these celebrations on that spot in the 1750s and throughout the 1760s. But what's really interesting about it is that that exact spot became the Liberty Tree in the 1760s. So it's a spot that was like ceremonially important for Black individuals living in Newport in the 1750s and early 1760s. And then it kind of gets, that same spot gets appropriated by like the Sons of Liberty and all these other kind of revolutionary figures who are protesting taxation policies and other things like that. So there's a kind of spatial element to it as well. But yeah, that point about African princes, yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, I'll say one more quick thing about that too. Knowing the kind of West African context, which I'm still learning about, actually lends itself to look back at the archival record in new ways. So one example is that when I look through, I'm looking down at my box right now that has this is why I'm looking down there, it has all the African Benevolent Society papers. One of the really interesting things that appears in the African Benevolent Society papers is before they would have, or when they would have their meeting, they had like a president and a treasurer and a secretary and things like that. And at the beginning of every meeting, they would say, the president having taken his chair, or the president having sat down, or something like that. And it would be a really kind of common thing to say, like, over and over and over again. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. Like, why would they mention that, right? And one of the things that's interesting to think about is the idea that a chair, or in particular a stool, was a really important way to demonstrate power in coastal West Africa. So a lot of leaders when they would hold council, they would sort of pull out a chair or pull out a stool or something, and there would be sort of a ceremonial stool or chair that would be a symbol of authority. So if you're reading these African Benevolent Society papers, it just seems like something to kind of quickly mention that, okay, well, yeah, they're coming in, they're sitting. But I'm wondering if there's a kind of West African cultural connection there, similar to the African princes thing that I think it was Tracy, I don't know, yeah. I think Tracy had mentioned. So
wow. A couple other questions. Linda was wondering, how did Newport and the others that went to Liberia, how did they die? Was it a sickness, virus, attack?
Yeah, it was we don't know specifically what it was, but it was sickness. Like, it wasn't attack, it wasn't military or anything like that. And then that's really fascinating, because it also, so much of the Sierra Leone and Liberia stuff gets into discussions of like climate and bodies and stuff like that, and so yeah, it was illness, yeah, as soon as they get there. And what's really tragic about it is that basically half of the group dies. There's like 35 of them, and something like 16 or 15 to 17 of them die within the first couple of weeks. And there are records, the Colonization Society has records of how many people went and how many people died within the first few weeks. And this ended up being like the worst kind of, the worst sale, or the worst experiment, or the worst emigration moment for the American Colonization Society. So it really kind of taps into some of those ideas about the dangers of it.
You mentioned that there was a lot of chatter in the news back in Newport, in surrounding area, about discouraging people. Did it really discourage people from going the colonization route back to Liberia?
Yeah, it becomes really, in New England, there are a couple of groups that go, but it's a much more prominent practice in like Virginia, in Virginia and Maryland. Virginia, the Chesapeake area, it's really common. And I don't think it discourages people in like Virginia and Maryland. But there aren't a lot of groups that leave, from New England, which is interesting. We have I didn't even mention like Paul Cuffey. There are these examples, Paul Cuffey, of trying to do this for Sierra Leone, but that's not entirely successful either. So yeah, so it fits into this sort of contentious controversy about African colonization as an answer to the problem of racial discrimination that they're facing.
Right. Now, did Newport Gardner's children go with him to Liberia? someone is asking what happened to them. Are there records for the kids?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that gets into sort of the genealogical stuff that I'm still working on. So he had a couple of children go with him. Or I should say he had a couple people go with him. He had, I think, 2 people go with him. One of whom was his son, Ahima Gardner, who sort of emerges as like kind of community leader, like protege of Newport Gardner, because he shows up in a lot of the Black Benevolent Society records. And then there's another person who goes with them, but it's just listed as like Gardner. There's no like first name. And so I'm not sure. I have to go back and look and see the age. It's possible that it could be one of his kids. We don't know a lot about what happened to his children. We know one of them went to New York in like 1815, but then ended up coming back. One of them, I think one of his grandkids served on like the USS Constitution. But I have to tell you, I've been looking through census records and vital records, and I'm not finding them that much, which is actually really interesting for such a large and kind of prominent Black family. And I'm getting the sense that they're leaving Newport in the 1820s and the 1830s, because I'm not really finding records. The one thing I have to find, there's a really early city directory in Providence that I have to look for, because that was a main theme. A lot of people, people of color in Newport, Rhode Island, moving up to Providence or Pawtucket, moving up north, where there's sort of a stronger economic base. But yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really struggling to find. I have little bits and pieces, but I can't put together sort of the whole story here, because I'm really struggling with the genealogical aspect of it.
Well, Tracy's asking sort of a related question. Was he able, when he won his freedom, did that apply to his wife and children? And then a second part to that question, does Newport have the manumission paper for him, or was there anything conditional about his freedom?
Yeah, we don't have, that's another tricky thing. We don't have the manumission record. I've looked for it at the Newport Historical Society. Bert Lippincott, who's like the main brain of the records of the Newport Historical Society. He knows Newport's history probably better than anybody. He hasn't found it either. And so I don't think there's a specific manumission paper for Newport Gardner, unfortunately. And whether he was able to free his wife and children, it's hard to know. We do know that by the time that we get to 1800, Caleb Gardner is still a slave holder. He still has a few people enslaved in his household, but it's not a large number. And so, and what I mean by that is that Newport Gardner had, between him and his wife, they had between 12 to 14 people living in their household at any time. They did have a couple children who passed away when they were relatively young, but they had a large family. And so that suggests that some people most likely got their freedom from Caleb Gardner when he manumitted Newport Gardner. But that to me would be such a huge find. One of the things we do have is that we do have a pretty big collection of other types of manumission papers to help me sort of contextualize that. And it would have been very common. Tracy's question about conditional, it would have been really, really common if it was conditional. If it was, I'm freeing Newport Gardner, but I'm retaining his service for a year or two. This is all throughout the manumission papers in the 1780s and 90s. I'm not gonna say almost all of them, but a lot of them have this. They have this, they'll have sort of rhetoric of liberty and equality and natural rights, and then they'll keep people in servitude for a year or two. So it would be conditional. So that I talk about that in the book, that it's quite possible that would be the case. It's a great question. Yeah.
I think there's not too many other questions. If anyone else has any more, go ahead and throw them in. Denise had a question about sources that you could recommend. She is beginning to research the slave trade in Rhode Island pre-revolution. So she was wondering if you could recommend any sources.
Yeah, the first stop, sorry, give me a second. I'm trying to apologize for the lack of caps. I'm just typing quickly. But Jay Cottree's Notorious Triangle is the sort of standard book on Rhode Island and the transatlantic slave trade. One of the things I'm sort of trying to do is tell this story from a biographical perspective, without kind of stepping on toe. There's been other scholars who have talked about Newport and it's either its role in the slave trade or the free Black community. And I'm sort of telling the story through Newport Gardner, but one of the first steps that I took when I started to do research was go to that book, because it's a history book, but it also has a very robust appendix for the slave voyages that took place. I would also say, let me just put this, the transatlantic slave trade database is still a really useful site. So Notorious Triangle is a good starting point, but I would also try the transatlantic slave trade database at slavevoyages.org, because that has more kind of updated information, because it's a digital, like it's an electronic resource. They can sort of update it as you go along. So I would go in there. The only thing about the slave voyages, it's really helpful for the larger picture, but it's not always complete information. So if you're looking for specific voyages, you might find it, but it's also really useful for identifying patterns. So that's why when I talk about Newport Gardner's origins, the transatlantic slave trade database was really important for me, because when I put in, Gardner leaving from Rhode Island, between say 1755 and 1765, when I put those entry fields in, it's Cape Coast Castle, Cape Coast Castle, Cape Coast Castle, Enamabo, Cape Coast Castle, Cape Coast Castle. It's the same locations over and over and over again. So what's frustrating for me is like, I don't know what ship he was on. I have some possibilities, but I do know the patterns thanks to the transatlantic slave trade database. Also, Christy Clark Pujara's dark work does have, I think, a chapter or two on this issue. So that'd be a good place to start and take a look at her footnotes as well. But yeah, Cotree, slave voyages. There's another book. I'm blank. It's The Voyage of the Slave Ship Hare, Hare, which is a little bit more about the slave ship itself, but also has a little bit of context there. But yeah, if you're interested in reaching out to me, Denise, feel free. You can send me an email separately. I'm sure Jen could provide it for you.
Yep, absolutely. Linda had one more question. Do you know where Newport Gardner lived? Is there any address for him?
That's a great question. So there is, okay. There's a great guidebook called, I didn't write this, I don't appear in this, so this is not like self-promotion either, but there's a great guidebook that came out years ago called African Americans in Newport by Richard Youngkin. And one of the, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but one of the great things that it has is it has like addresses for where different people lived. People within the free Black community are really important, figures who impacted the free Black community. It's kind of organized by neighborhoods. One of the problems with this is that it's not, there's, I don't know, you can see some of the ways in which it's organized by neighborhood. One of the problems is that Bert has suggested that in his own findings, Bert Lippincott in the Newport Historical Society has been finding that some of the material in there is not always accurate. So I think if you asked me this, who asked me this? Linda. Linda, I think if you asked me this maybe 10 years ago, I could say, oh yeah, he lives at Pope Street. Here's the house. This is where it's like 25 Pope Street or whatever number it is. This is where it is. I can kind of take you there right now. Bert Lippincott's research has suggested that maybe we're not so sure. I will say that there was a free Black neighborhood on Pope Street in Newport, Rhode Island after the American Revolution. So even if we don't know his specific address, we do know that he was in that. We do know that he was in that space and on that street, which is kind of interesting. And it's also fascinating because it's where a lot of these meetings would take place. Like the beginning of the first Black church in Newport, started at Newport Gardner's house itself. So yeah, that would be something that I want to look into a little bit more. Again, the Newport doesn't have city directories that go back that early, unfortunately. But there is some evidence to suggest that it may not be what you might find on the internet or what you might find in the Youngkin book specifically. So.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's it for questions. That was really interesting. I'm can't wait to hear more about the project and an update again down the road.
Great.
Please, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. And I know Jen, you have an announcement, but thank you for questions and your suggestions too. And so if any of you have, a follow-up, feel free you can shoot me an email. I'll actually put my email in the chat if you have any questions about, if you're doing your own research on the slave trade or anything like that. You can shoot me a note and I'm happy to help. So
awesome. Thank you. Well, I just want to end today with just mentioning a couple of upcoming programs that we have. We're doing another behind the scenes tour of GFox. We have a very large collection of GFox material. So we have 2 tours we're offering on Saturday, November 26th at 11 or 2, and then on that Sunday, the 27th at 2. There is a fee, 10 for members and $15 for non-members. And then we're doing a fun night at the museum. We're doing trivia on December 1st, and it's sort of an 80s theme. You're certainly welcome to come and dig out all your 80s clothes and come in costume. And that's $12 per player, and that's on site as well. And then our next Lunch and Learn is December 6th. And that is another New England Regional Fellowship Consortium fellow. And the title is A Young Sad Country, Melancholia in Colonial New England and Its Impact on Early American Literature. So those are just some upcoming programs we have, and please feel free to check out our website for additional happenings at the museum. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, Professor Andrews. That was really great.
thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Bye.